Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Painting over the murals, charter schools in flux, and much more tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by a roundtable of journalists, including Toby Sells, news editor from the Memphis Flyer, Ryan Poe, reporter with the Commercial Appeal, Laura Faith Kebede is an education reporter with Chalkbeat. Thanks for being here, along with Bill Dries, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. We'll start with the murals, and I don't know, maybe I'm going to go to you, I think, Ryan, just to maybe give us the rundown of what happened. Maybe people saw it out of the corner of their eye. It was a strange day. Was it Monday that this happened, or it was recently that these murals that had been painted by Paint Memphis were painted over by the city?
Yeah, there was more than 100 artists had painted these murals, the beautiful murals, many of them on this area of public property and private property at Lamar and Willett in South Memphis in Midtown. So what happened was the city crews, they didn't like 6 of the murals. The city council members singled out 6 of the murals for being painted over. They sent out the public works crews, and they painted over 7 murals, none of which were the 6 that were originally planned to be painted. So it was a flub from the city. The public works director admitted that it was a miscommunication, his fault, and now they've put a halt on all painting over of murals until they can have a city council meeting to kind of flesh out or sort out what happened.
Toby, I mean, thoughts on it? It was sort of a strange circus of confusion and a lot of disappointment and a lot of frustration, and a lot of anger on social media. People who didn't like some of the murals in the neighborhoods. I think it was a couple of city council members who had gotten a lot of pushback from their constituents, felt like they didn't have input on the murals that were painted. There was a Grim Reaper sort of themed one that we had some of the people from Paint Memphis on, Karen Golightly and another woman, Lauren Kennedy, on talking about that 2 months ago. But the way it was, quote, taken care of was strange.
Bizarre. As I watched it unfold, I still didn't have a full grasp on how this was getting done. You know, city council members are now telling Public Works how to go and what to paint over and things. There were no votes taken on what murals to take down and how to take them down and all that. Was the mayor involved in this? I mean, it's his administration. And council members just saying, go do this thing, and it happens. I thought, what is happening here? The processes just seem to be breaking down, or maybe there's something I don't understand about how all this is working out. But I do think at the end of the day, and hopefully the next council meeting, they'll kind of figure some of this stuff out. It does show that we've got to have some kind of process for this thing. We've got to have a professional, standard issue way to go about either putting murals up or taking them down, and hopefully we'll get there.
Bill, your thoughts?
Well, the council members, when they had what was a pretty lively discussion with Karen Golightly about specifically the Paint Memphis murals, that confrontation ended with the council members saying, all right, here's what we're going to do. All of us are going to come up with the specific murals that offend us, and we're going to write a letter to Public Works, a formal request that Public Works paint over these specific murals. So that letter's in the works in January. And it's part of a process. There's also a process that's used for the removal of graffiti. These are not considered to be graffiti. So the letter's in circulation in January. The next month, as a matter of fact, the first council meeting in February, the council members are talking about the Urban Arts Commission and how they're about to appoint a new board to that, which is part of a separate process with that. And then some of the council members say, well, what happened to our request about painting over those murals? They haven't been painted over, and we want them painted over. They were quite insistent about it. The meeting broke up, continued into the hallway with the council members telling Robert Connect, when are you going to paint those over? We want them painted over now. That weekend, you start seeing them painted over. One panel had actually been painted over earlier, but
were the ones, back to Ryan, I mean, back to the confusion about it, were the ones that the city council members requested those were not the ones that were painted over?
No.
No.
They were not.
No,
But
it was just a general paint over on one side of Willette too. We should add
they were trying to paint them all.
I got it. Okay. And there's graffiti. I mean, I think I saw on social media some people taking pictures that now the tan walls over the have graffiti all over, them, which is part of the whole argument of the people who are in favor of murals is that that it is their art and they make the neighborhood look better and they prohibit or they down people don't put graffiti on the murals by and large.
You did have neighborhood leaders who were among the initial presentation to the council who said we don't want this there. It was more than the council members.
Thank you.
And there are other people in the community who think this is pretty neat.
Yeah. And I think when we had, Paint Memphis is an independent, they're not city funded. They're an independent group that had a contractor agreement with the city to do this. Urban Art Commission is in part funded by the city, does sculptures, does murals, does all kinds of things. I mean, it does seem like some need for some clarity on how these groups all work together and where the murals go and public input. And that whole idea, we were talking before the show, Toby, of public input and a process behind this, in some ways, it gets back to the statues. And this week there was even the people who adamantly wanted those statues to come down, there were people who were concerned about the process, that it was not transparent enough. And we had Bruce McMullen, the city legal officer, on the show and so on. But there were some parallels in a way about process or lack of process. However, the state comptroller came forward with a report looking at the process about the statues this week, and what did they find?
They found that it was all above board, that they followed the right rules of open meetings and paying less than market value accepting less than market value for the parks. But the part that I think a lot of folks are concerned about is the actual vote itself. The ordinance had been going through the regular legislative process, and you guys help me out and tell me if this is all true, accurate. It came down to the final vote, and there was a substitute ordinance put up by Edmund Ford that was given to all the council members. They didn't read it. They didn't offer copies of it to the press or the public at all. I don't think it was in the agenda packet, and they just handed it out, no discussion. They approved it, and they moved on with the meeting. And I think even reporters had to go and try to beg to get copies of this ordinance after the meeting went down. Is that that's how it went down, right?
It is, and plus Edmund Ford was about to read the ordinance actually, and then they stopped him, and they went on ahead with the vote. So, yeah.
All of that have people thinking, how can this be legal? I mean, the public needs to know what they're voting on when they're voting on it. And folks have said that this was done in secrecy, done in the dark. There's something else going on there. But the state comptroller's office of Open Records Counsel, he said that several Nashville lawmakers had wanted this all looked into to see if this was all above board. So they launched a review. I think it took a few weeks to look into this stuff. The report that came out yesterday said that auditors had a look at all the open meetings, all the Open Records Acts, and everything, and said that the whole thing was above board and it was done legally.
Yeah, they had one question on the way the nonprofit was set up, though. I think, right? Which the city pushed back on, but.
Yeah, the state report said that there should have been a memorandum of understanding that went to the financial ability of the nonprofit on this, and that wasn't in place. The city's response was, we've done others this way that didn't include the memorandum of understanding. We have confidence of the financial ability of the nonprofit, and the state controller said, we still want to see a memorandum of understanding, so there will be one.
Yeah, and we'll stay with that for a minute, and then we'll switch over to education and get Laura involved. I know I was up in Nashville at the legislature a couple weeks ago, and there was a lot of discussion about whether there'd be sort of retribution on the part of Nashville. The comptroller, that's a first indication that maybe there won't be. That's a Republican comptroller that came forward and said this was, with one real footnote, this was a legal process. There were some bills proposed, a variety of them, that would shut down the ability of cities to do this, that would punish cities that tried to do this. I don't know if anyone knows if those are getting any momentum. Let's go, Ryan, and then go back to Bill.
Yeah, the feeling I've gotten from talking to state lawmakers, most people think that those are not going to get much momentum, especially the more radical ones that would be more damaging to cities in the future. One of them, the main one, would be that would affect us would be if a state law is approved that would let the state seize our statues, take ownership of the statues, and that would kind of let the state control what happens to them. So that's one of the bills among several that are on the table.
Yeah. Any other thought on that?
The retroactive bill, the sponsor of that bill acknowledges that he probably does not have the votes on it. And the sponsors of some of the others have actually said that they're not sure if what the city did is illegal or legal. It might be legal, that they acknowledged.
We'll come back to some other things going on in the legislature, but I wanted to switch over to education, and there is a ton going on. Laura, we've had you on the show once, twice before. Tell people, and I probably should have done this in the past, tell people first what Chalkbeat is, and then where do you want to start with all of the many things going on in education?
Sure. So Chalkbeat is a nonprofit news organization. We cover Shelby County, specifically Shelby County schools and the Achievement School District. We also cover state policy. And we've been around for about 4-ish years now in Memphis. And we have a team of 2 people here in Memphis and someone else in Nashville.
Yeah, and we run your stories in the Memphis Daily News. I think they've appeared in other publications and so on. So, but where do you want to start? The Jubilee schools, the charter schools that are on watch. Where do we start?
Well, I think one thing that is really interesting about the charter schools that are in danger of being closed is that this is the first time for this new process to be in place. A couple of years ago, Shelby County Schools flagged several charter schools and closed 3 of them for low performance. But there wasn't a tried and true process in place to really vet that. A lot of the charter schools complained that they had no warning whatsoever. And so since then, there's been a charter compact committee of charter leaders and district leaders to be able to say, what can we all agree to be more accountable, because charter schools do have more flexibility and power than district-run schools. And so with that power comes a little bit more accountability. So this is the first time that this process is going in place. And so there have been 7 schools that have been flagged under this new process.
And do they have a year or 2 years or some period of time in which they have to turn things around?
Yeah, so what they'll do is in the next couple of days, they'll within the month of being notified, they need to have an improvement plan. And so when the next year of test scores come back, if things also haven't improved, they'll have another chance for an improvement plan. And if still that doesn't do anything, then they'll be recommended for revocation.
And there are, Bill, 50 or either of you, 50 charter schools in the city. And it is interesting. I mean, you get education advocates, education reform advocates who say charter schools are the answer to everything. Charter schools are going to change the nation. This kind of points out, and you get other people who say, look, they're not perfect. They're an attempt. They can be an experiment. There's some charter schools that have incredible performance, some that don't. I mean, your take, you cover education as well.
The question is, how do you gauge the response? When the ASD was in its original form, the complaint from the school system is that the state can come in pretty much at any time and just say, we're taking this failing school, and that failing school. And the complaint from the school system was, why doesn't it work that way for the charter schools? And in effect, the school board did actually say, no, this charter school is closed, this one is closed at one point in the earlier process. Dorsey Hobson, the superintendent of Shelby County Schools, has called really the set of rules around charter schools prior to this kind of the wild, wild west. Even things like how many students are you going to have in your charter school? That's an estimate that in some cases has been off pretty widely from the mark originally set once the school is up and running.
And let me give some, for people who don't follow us closely, and you guys correct me where I get some things wrong. So the charter schools, which have been in Memphis for a decade or more now, various charters, they apply to the Shelby County schools. They have to meet certain conditions, a certain level of financial and stability, and they've got a plan for this charter school. They start, the money follows the child. So the money that comes from the state for each child comes out of the Shelby County public school system and goes with that child to the charter school. Is that correct? Those charter schools then sometimes maybe raise other money from philanthropy or other sources. Am I right so far? ASD is the Achievement School District, which Governor Haslam put in place as a way to take over failing schools across the state. Most of them were in Memphis. And Chris Barbick was the original superintendent of that. He was on the show a number of times when he started up. And some of those takeovers have worked, and some they haven't improved results. Is that fair to say of the ASD schools? I mean,
there have been very little, small amount of schools that have actually made it outside of the bottom 5% of schools in the state. So there's been a lot of changes of curbing the power of the Achievement School District in the past year or so, to be still one of the most severe option that the state refers to turn around failing schools, but is no longer the most powerful tool that they use.
And maybe when Governor Haslam was on, Bill, but on the show, but at various points he's acknowledged that there's been the ASD hasn't worked in some cases, but has pointed out that threat. It took that threat. In part, the Shelby County schools, innovation zone schools, which have performed really well, have been a response to the ASD, right? And
right.
that pressure, that competitive pressure, I think Haslam would point out and say, and others and say, well, maybe the ASD didn't work as designed, but it pressured Shelby County into doing a better job.
Yeah, the I-Zone schools were part of the original ASD legislation. It was an option for the school systems to use, but that's essentially been the argument because the I-Zones, by most standards, have performed better than the ASD schools in a head-to-head comparison. And the ASD's argument has been, yeah, but would the school system be addressing this with the urgency that it is if it were not for the idea that the ASD could come in and take any schools on pretty
Well, and the
short
counter argument too that I've heard is that there wasn't funds to flow enough funds because the I-Zone is a more expensive model, and they're saying, well, now that we have the funds through this legislation, we can now use that urgency. So there's that competing argument that.
What's going on with the Jubilee schools? Do you want to take that, or do you want, who wants that? The Jubilee schools, which are the set of Catholic schools, what are there, 9 of them?
Yeah, we had a set of 9 Jubilee schools who will actually be in their 20th year when they close at the end of the 1920 school year.
2020 school year, yes.
Yeah.
Or 2019 or 2020?
No, 2019, 2020. And so these schools have been in business for 20 years. These are schools that are in the inner city in some cases. They're resurrected schools that had been parish schools a long time ago. And the Catholic,
they're not charter schools, they're Catholic schools.
No, they are, they're not operated by charters. So the Catholic school system was having the same problems that some of the charters in the inner city have had, and that is with low enrollment. So they announced that they will be closing. There's a new charter group whose board is led by John Smorelli, the president of Christian Brothers University, who's also been involved in the Crosstown High School charter school.
And the Maxine Smith STEAM Academy charter across the street from CBU.
Right. And so the plan is for that charter group to effectively take over the Catholic Jubilee schools. These will become secular schools in the process. So this is a pretty big group to become charter schools.
Yeah. Other thoughts going on in education? We talked a little before the show that it's kind of quiet at the legislature right now in terms of education bills that are coming forward, but other thoughts that are on your radar right now?
Well, just to get back to the Jubilee schools, I think it's really interesting that this is not the only time in the nation where this has happened, where Catholic schools are saying, well, we are not having enough enrollment, we're not getting enough funds that we need to serve the students from low-income families that we're targeting. And so there have been in other places in DC, Indianapolis, I want to say Milwaukee as well, where Catholic schools have turned to, well, what about this charter option? If we are able to get public funds and still operate our buildings and provide education that not the religious aspect, but still provide education in a way. So I think that's interesting as we're looking at what is happening here in Memphis. We're not alone in that.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I mean, as there are more options in inner city schools and parents have choices in terms of optional schools, in terms of different types of charter schools, I wonder how much that was a factor, that the Jubilee schools used to be the only other option in the inner city. Now there are a whole lot more. We're talking about education, grade fixing, and what's the update there?
Well, the latest is that Superintendent Dorsey Hobson has responded to the state's inquiry of different questions that they had of who has access to grades after they have already been given. And one thing that he's done in response is shortened the list of people who have access to changing grades after they've already been given. But in that list, which is the school records secretary, and one other person that the principal designates, whether that's an assistant principal or someone else. he's shortened that list to those 2 people. But that would not have prevented what happened at Trezevant, because this started with the record secretary.
Yeah. We could talk more, but we'll move on. We'll shift a little bit with the 6-7 minutes we have left and stay with the legislature. Toby, what's the update on, I think last time we were on, we were talking about medical marijuana and a bill being proposed in the House. It's got a little more momentum as the session goes along.
It does. This summer, there were meetings all over the state looking at medical cannabis here, and you've got an East Tennessee Republican, Jeremy Faison, House member, who's been really pushing this, brought the bill back to Nashville this session, and just recently, Beth Harwell, Speaker of the House, has signed on, says she's going to support it, and that's a huge move for medical cannabis here in Tennessee. That kind of same power was the tipping point for the wine and grocery stores bill that fought for years in the legislature. Finally, some leadership got behind it, and that was enough to push it over. So we'll see if that's enough this session to get medical cannabis over, but it's at least got more people looking at it and thinking about it.
Other things going on with the whole lot of stories right now. One, maybe an update, Bill, and maybe Ryan want to comment on too, on various statewide races. So the governor's race is underway. I hosted a forum with the Tennessee Press Association 2 weeks ago, something like that. Had most, not all, the candidates on there. It was interesting, but Republican and Democratic candidates. It's interesting to hear them run in a really great economy, and so they had to find ways to sort of separate themselves and say, yeah, Haslam, the economy's great, and but these things aren't working.
Well,
it was fascinating.
And one of the more interesting things, to me, was that Carl Dean, the former mayor of Nashville, who is one of the Democratic contenders, is saying ideology really shouldn't matter in who is governor. And you have 5 major Republican contenders who are in various ways, in different shades, who are saying, yes, ideology does matter.
Yeah.
And so the idea that it's about building coalitions has become Dean's answer to the economic success that the state is having with a Republican governor and supermajorities in the House and Senate.
Yeah, and Randy Boyd opening an office here in the next couple of weeks. I mean, a lot of people saying Shelby County will sort of turn the tide. I was up in Nashville around the time of the forum. Chattanooga was saying, yeah, we're going to turn the tide, and the people in Nashville saying, no, we're the most important area. They're going to turn the tide.
Well, no candidate is going to come to X city in Tennessee and say, no, I really don't know why I'm here in this place.
But it would be so refreshing, wouldn't it? It would be fabulous.
I might vote for that in some cases. Yeah.
Other thoughts on that? Maybe the Senate race. Corker, Bob Corker, the senator, U.S. senator here, who is going to retire, has been very critical of Donald Trump, is now thinking about not retiring.
It's huge, and it's changed the whole shape of that race. He was out. There were a lot of other contenders in there.
Marsha Blackburn, the House member from and a big Trump supporter from the Nashville area,
yes,
being the prime Republican candidate for that job, and Phil Bredesen, the former governor, Democrat, 73 years old, coming out of retirement, dusting off the campaign shoes as a Democrat to maybe run against Marsha Blackburn. But I cut you off.
No, it's just that these people were rushing to fill that void, and then all of a sudden Corker's having second thoughts, and it just again changed the entire shape of that whole election. Yeah.
It's also behind the scenes. What was happening was Politico got a hold of an internal poll that was weighted toward Republican voters, and in that poll, Bredesen finished ahead of Blackburn in a general election matchup by 3 to 4 percentage points, which is the margin of error.
Yeah, and a lot of people were talking. I mean, if Bredesen got in, he's a very wealthy guy, so he can self-fund a tremendous, to a large degree. But also that all the national money, the Senate leadership conference, the Democratic, I can't remember the name of it, but if they would almost match his money. So if they saw a viable Democratic candidate who would put up their own money, then they would start pouring huge amounts of money into the race, even just as a sort of, in the shell game of forcing Republicans nationally to put money into Tennessee, a state that they had otherwise thought was safe.
Yeah, it's a 51 to 49 margin in favor of the Republicans in the Senate in terms of the seats. And the Republicans, looking at that poll, are starting to see a possibility that the seat might change.
Well, just with a couple minutes left, we'll shift. Ryan, there was a protest this week, a march downtown. Tell us about that.
Yeah, March for 15. More than 500 protesters, by my estimates, got together downtown. They had a strike at the McDonald's on Union. Then later that day, they went downtown. They marched, taking the same route that the 1968 sanitation workers took to City Hall. And the whole point of it was to say that we need a $15 minimum wage, living wage, and yeah, there's a lot of people from out of town. I'd say more than half of the people were from out of town.
Really? Yeah. And did Strickland have a response, the mayor? Because in part they were protesting the mayor. It's in the mayor's seat to raise the minimum wage.
The mayor can't really do a whole lot about minimum wage in a general sense. He can control how much city employees are paid, and he put out a statement saying that he supports higher wages generally, and that no city employee makes under $12 an hour.
And this is the first. I mean, there are more things happening as we move towards April. I don't know what in the observance of the 50th anniversary of King's death.
This was kind of a kickoff of the activities we'll see. The march, which also included Reverend William Barber's Moral Mondays group, which is organizing a new Poor People's campaign, is actually involved in it as well. This happened 50 years to the day that the strike actually began.
All right, well, we've run out of time, but we'll talk a whole lot more about that. Thank you all, and thank you for joining us. Join us again next week.
The public works director admitted that it was a miscommunication, his fault, and now they've put a halt on all painting over of murals until they can have a city council meeting to kind of flesh out or sort out what happened.
Toby, I mean, thoughts on it? It was sort of a strange circus of confusion and a lot of disappointment and a lot of frustration, a lot of anger on social media. People who didn't like some of the murals in the neighborhoods. I think it was a couple of city council members who had gotten a lot of pushback from their constituents, felt like they didn't have input on the murals that were painted. There was a Grim Reaper sort of themed one that we had some of the people from Paint Memphis on, Karen Golightly and another woman, Lauren Kennedy, on talking about that 2 months ago. But the way it was, quote, taken care of was strange.
Bizarre. As I watched it unfold, I still didn't have a full grasp on how this was getting done. You know, city council members are now telling Public Works how to go and what to paint over and things. There were no votes taken on what murals to take down and how to take them down and all that. Was the mayor involved in this? I mean, it's his administration. And council members just saying, go do this thing, and it happens. I thought, what is happening here? The processes just seem to be breaking down, or maybe there's something I don't understand about how all this is working out. But I do think at the end of the day, and hopefully the next council meeting, they'll kind of figure some of this stuff out. It does show that we've got to have some kind of process for this thing. We've got to have a professional, standard issue way to go about either putting murals up or taking them down, and hopefully we'll get there.
Bill, your thoughts?
Well, the council members, when they had what was a pretty lively discussion with Karen Golightly about specifically the Paint Memphis mural.
Bill Dries, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. We'll start with the murals, and I don't know, maybe I'm going to go to you, I think, Ryan, just to maybe give us the rundown of what happened. Maybe people saw it out of the corner of their eye. It was a strange day. Was it Monday that this happened, or it was recently that these murals that have been painted by Paint Memphis were painted over by the city? Yeah,
there was more than 100 artists had painted these murals, the beautiful murals, many of them on this area of public property and private property at Lamar and Willett in South Memphis in Midtown. So what happened was the city crews, they didn't like 6 of the murals. The city council members singled out 6 of the murals for being painted over. They sent out the public works crews, and they painted over 7 murals, none of which were the 6 that were originally planned to be painted. So it was a flub from the city.
That confrontation ended with the council members saying, all right, here's what we're going to do. All of us are going to come up with the specific murals that offend us, and we're going to write a letter to Public Works, a formal request that Public Works paint over these specific murals. So that letter's in the works in January. And it's part of a process. There's also a process that's used for the removal of graffiti. These are not considered to be graffiti. So the letter's in circulation in January. The next month, as a matter of fact, the first council meeting in February, the council members are talking about the Urban Arts Commission and how they're about to appoint a new board to that, which is part of a separate process with that. And then some of the council members say, well, what happened to our record?
Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Painting over the murals, charter schools in flux, and much more tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by a roundtable of journalists, including Toby Sells, news editor from the Memphis Flyer, Ryan Poe, reporter with the Commercial Appeal, Faith Kebede is an education reporter with Chalkbeat. Thanks for being here. Along with